Good morning, YouTube. This is going to be a short little video where I show you how to do a service on your oil burner. Disclaimer right up front, do not attempt this at home. If you are not trained or qualified to service oil burners, refer it to a trained person to come and do the work for you. This is to give you more of an idea of what happens when they do it, not necessarily so that you could do it yourself. You have been warned. If you damage your equipment or you burn your house down, that's not my fault. So let's get started. First things first, turn off the power. There's usually one or two emergency switches on a furnace. On mine, there's one right here on the side of the furnace itself. There's also one at the top of the basement stairs. You should have one at the top of the basement stairs so that you can get to it in an emergency and not have to approach the furnace if it should be in some sort of jeopardy. The next thing you should do is disconnect or turn off the oil supply. You're going to see two oil lines down here. I'll explain that in a minute, but to turn this off, all you have to do is unscrew the knob, and it should snap down. You heard it snap down. It may slide down. The way these things work is there's a piece of metal in here that melts at a very low temperature, so if there is a fire, this will shut the valve off. It melts and the valve closes. But you open it manually like this, and it's unscrewing it that closes it. It's kind of counterintuitive. To cover what the other fuel line is, this is the line here to my main tank that's buried outside. And this is a line that goes to what I call the emergency tank. It's a 15-gallon tank here in the basement that I use in the event that I run out of oil. I can put diesel fuel in it. I also, when I run out of oil in the summertime, I switch over to this tank because I only really need a small amount of oil to heat the domestic water in the house, and there's no need to go and get the big tank filled until prices are better during the summer. I also leave it connected to allow the oil in the main tank to settle out any contaminants to the bottom of the tank so I don't draw them into the filter. Alright, let's get started on the service. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to change the oil filter, and I'll show you how you do that. So these are the tools that we'll be using today for doing the maintenance on the furnace. Your tools necessary and wrench sizes and what have you will vary. So we have some open-ended and box wrench combinations here. Try and use the box end side whenever possible, just so you don't round off any bolts. We have some sockets and a handle. We also have one deep socket for the bolts at the top of the furnace, screwdriver, cleaning brush, a small pick, some cleaning fluid for doing some cleaning. But one thing that won't vary from furnace to furnace is one, safety glasses. Very important. You only have one set of eyes. Don't put them in jeopardy. A respirator. Again, the same thing. You only have one set of lungs. Don't put them in jeopardy. This is very important, especially when it gets to cleaning the heat exchangers and the firebox. You do not want to be breathing that dust in. It's not very good for you. A good set of gloves to protect your hands. It has to be something that can stand up to both the cleaning fluid and the fuel oil. So I would say not to use any kind of latex glove. These are what they call nitrile gloves. They're rather thick. They're designed for protecting your hands for automotive work. I use them all the time. Keeps the dust and dirt off your hands and the grease and grime from under your fingernails. Makes cleaning up later a little easier. A wire brush for cleaning the surfaces. One have you, both a larger one and a smaller one. Also not shown here is a shop vacuum. that I use to vacuum up the dust with. You'll need to use a two-stage vacuum, so most single-stage shop vacs can't handle the dust and end up blowing it back in the room. Two specialty tools. One here that I purchased, it's the only one I purchased specifically for this furnace. This is a Z tool. It's used for making sure that the electrodes are in the right place. I'll show you that later when we get to servicing the burner. And the last one is a tool that I actually made. This is a pressure gauge. It goes all the way up to 200 psi. This furnace runs anywhere between 125 and 130 psi, and that's to make sure that the pump is still functional and isn't starting to wear down. There is an adjustment on the pump to increase the pressure if necessary. I tested. I've never had to actually change it, but it's a good thing just to make sure everything's working right. And that's about it with the tools. So now we'll start getting to work on servicing the furnace. In this photograph, you see the parts that will be necessary to do this service. The filter element is the gray felt piece at the bottom of the photograph. The element will depend on the kind of filter container that you have. There are several different models available. This is the one I use. Above that is the rubber gasket for the filter cup. And to the left of that is the burner nozzle. You have to take the numbers off the side of your existing nozzle to find out which one you need to replace it. Any furnace parts store will have those nozzles in stock. They're not very expensive. And then once again, just above that is the orange Z tool that's used to set up the spark elements and also can be used to set the depth of the burner nozzle if you should happen to move the setting or need to adjust it. Okay, so here we are. We're going to be disconnecting the fuel line and then changing the oil filter. We'll empty the filter first because the container will be full of oil and we don't want that dribbling out all over the floor while we're working. So a couple of components that we have here. We have the main burner with its pump. There's a solenoid valve on this burner that turns the oil on and off. There's a delay set up on mine so that the blower runs for a few seconds before the fire starts. That's to get the draft going. The oil filter. And this is called a Tiger Loop. What it's specifically designed to do is eliminate air from the fuel lines. If any air gets in the lines, either coming from outside or coming from an emergency tank, it comes to the top here, and this little float will come down and it'll vent through the top. Alright, very important on systems with two lines, one a feed and return. Not so important on regular single line supplies, but it's there just to keep things good and clean. Again, the power is turned off, the fuel line is shut. So for what we're going to need is to loosen the nut on the top here, which will allow me to remove the filter cup. I'm going to need a socket wrench. Alright, in this case, it is a 5/8 inch socket. We just put it here and we loosen it. Alright, there is also a nut on the bottom, which is a 1/2 inch. Normally that doesn't need to be loosened, but if it should turn, you'll use a 1/2 inch box wrench, and I just have it here handy. Now, you'll notice that on mine, I was very careful not to push down on this bolt to drive the cup off the bottom, because I didn't want it to go splashing to the floor. There's a washer right here, a little seal on the top, and then you just kind of grab the cup and give it a little twist and it should pull free. Inside that cup is the filter. First there's a gasket right here, and then there is the filter itself, which can pull straight out. I'm going to need two hands to do this. I'm also going to drain the oil that's in here back into my emergency tank after I take it out. You'll notice that this is fairly clean. That's because I change this thing every single year. I also use the precaution of allowing the oil to settle after it's filled before I start using it. That tends to keep the filter clean and the whole system running better. Also running on diesel fuel, it's cleaner. It's got detergents in it, so it makes life a little easier when it comes to servicing. So I'm going to remove that filter, and then I'll just kind of show it to you real quick, and then we'll proceed. Okay, so we've removed the filter. Let's see if I can get out of the light here. You can see that it's fairly clean. I have seen filters that are literally look like they've been dipped in black toothpaste, probably because they either haven't been changed in a long time or there's a lot of sediment in the tank. If you see a lot of goo on the, for lack of a better term, on your filter, you probably need to kind of explore where it's coming from. Again, the filter is there as protection for the pump. It keeps that debris from getting into the pump. You can see here also that the oil in this is pretty clean. So that tells me that I'm not pulling in any contaminants through the fuel lines, and the fuel system is in pretty good shape. So the next step we're going to do is we're going to get a wrench and we're going to take off the fuel supply line, and so that will allow me to pivot open the front cover of the burner to get to the firebox. Alright, we're now ready to take off that flare nut that is right here. I've already loosened it because it was going to take two hands. So I have a box wrench here, 3/4 inch box wrench. You just put it on to the nut and you turn it, in this case clockwise, to loosen it. Unscrew it. And then just let it hang. They call it a flare nut because you can see here at the top of the pipe, see if I can get some light here, there's a flare on the end of the pipe, and that fits into a cone shape on the end of the fitting, and the nut presses them together to make a tight seal. So just leave this aside. It's going to make it so that I don't have to bend this pipe to swing open the burner. The next step here is to disconnect, in this case, the alarm wiring, and then also disconnect the feed and signal lines from the burner control and the burner. I'm going to need two hands because I don't want to break the wires. That wire down here feeds the motor control. In this case, it's a Beckett. It has the Beckett igniter, the Beckett control, and also the Beckett display. I'll show you that later. That allows you to configure your burner control. This is a piece that's normally carried by a technician. You can purchase it separately from Beckett. You can leave it permanently attached. I also have the adapter here that allows me to connect a switch to an alarm that I have that goes off when this trips because there's a burner failure. It sets off an audible alarm so that people in a house can know that the furnace is not working before it gets so cold. And to open the cover, there's a nut here and a nut down here. There's a hinge on this side, and this whole assembly will just swing open. So we'll take those two nuts off and I'll show you what that looks like when I open it. Okay, I've removed the two bolts. Now you need to open this very carefully. There is a fiberglass gasket that is behind this door. It's very important that you not damage it. If it is damaged, you're going to need to replace it because it's very important that it doesn't leak when you put it back together, because that's what prevents the carbon monoxide from getting into your house. So we're going to open this very carefully, making sure that the gasket, and you can see here it's sitting on top, that the gasket does not tear. So there is the firebox, which is relatively clean. What you're looking for in here is any evidence that this liner has burned through. The liner protects the furnace from the intense heat. Let's see if I can get a little light in there. Alright, you can see where the circle of flame burns on that. I've also put in an extra piece here at the bottom just as an added piece of protection. And then on the back of the door, you have insulating material. There are bolts and flat washers that hold that in place. I have had these rust through and fall off and found the washers laying in the bottom of the burner. That will cause this eventually, this insulation, which you can see is quite thick, to fall in. So if you do find that situation, you go out and get yourself some new bolts. Steel, stainless steel. Stainless steel might work better, but they're harder to find in this size. And make sure that they stay attached. And then here is the back of the burner. And right in the center there, that shiny bit, that is the nozzle. Let me get this level. That is the nozzle that we're going to replace later on. So the next step, after we've got this open, is going to be taking the top off the furnace to get to the top of the heat exchanger to clean it. To do that, there are two bolts. One right here on the other side at the end of my finger, and one right there, and then this whole cover will lift off. It will be a little more difficult if your furnace setup uses this top opening, which the punch out is still in place. Mine comes out the back. If your furnace, the flue, comes out of the top, you're going to have to be able to pull this up, maybe turn it or twist it, and slide it up and then hang it with a piece of wire from the ceiling so it stays out of the way. I would not take the flue pipe off unless you absolutely have to. And if you do, there's probably going to be some sealing compound or rusty screws that need to be replaced. And just try and avoid it if you can. The furnace is set up so that there's a cutout here in the back so that you can lift this up a little bit and swing it out of the way, or pull it out of the way, get it past those pipes. This is the hot water supply for the baseboard heating, and then this is the pressure relief valve. Whatever you do, do not lift this lever or hook it on anything or pull it up, because it's liable to cause the overflow to leak, and then you're going to have to get in there and replace it, which means shutting off the water supply, draining the system, then filling it back up with water and purging all the air. So you need to be very careful. Okay, so now we just lift this cover off the top. Binding a little bit here on the side. We lift it and pull it out of the way. And that reveals the top of the burner. Now, there's two plates here. This plate you do not remove. This is the plate that would come off if for some reason you're going to use the top for the flue rather than the side. Then there are these 4 bolts on the outside. Now, also as a reminder, this is hot. Alright? We shut the furnace off, but you can see that it's still well over, what's that, 20, 30, 140 degrees in there. So be very careful when you're working in here. It is quite warm. Also, before I open this firebox up, I'm going to put on the respirator that I showed you at the beginning of the video to make sure that I don't inhale any of the dust here. I'm also going to close the burner door again, just to make sure that it doesn't fill the whole house full of soot. Alright, so we're going to take off these 4 bolts. We're going to lift off this cover. You'll notice this fiber gasket material. It's also, as with the door, very important that when you lift this off, you don't damage it in any way. It is something that you can buy locally, and you kind of just cut it into strips and lay it around the edge and then put the cover back on. I've had to replace it, I believe, once in the last 15 years. But again, if you damage it, it's pretty inexpensive. You buy it in a bag or on a spool, and you just cut it to fit. And again, it's very important. It keeps the carbon monoxide that's in the boiler or the firebox from getting into your house. Okay, so we have pulled off all the bolts. I do apologize if I sound a little muffled. I have my respirator on. Breathing in the soot in here, excuse me, is not a good thing. You want to avoid that. You also want to make sure that you wear gloves and that you wear eye protection. So we're going to lift this off very carefully from both sides. Normally I'd use two hands, but I have to hold the camera. And as you can see, the gasket is staying on, or most of the gasket is staying on the top. Alright, and we want to make sure that any of these pieces, as you can see in the corner there, they get put back in the right place. So we're going to remove this and set it aside. And look down here at the heat exchanger. Now, I don't know if I can get enough light in here for you to really see it. There are two sides. There's the fins on this side, and there's also the same fins on here. There are a series of fingers that stick out into the hot gases as they pass by, and they're what exchange the heat into the boiler, which is this piece here, and also the domestic hot water heater is right here. So these are fairly clean because I cleaned them a year ago, and I run this furnace very efficiently. That means there's a very minimal amount of soot that has built up. To clean these, there is a brush that you can pick up at a heating supply place. I showed you at the beginning of the video. That is this brush. And you're going to run this diagonally down into the firebox, over all of this, and then in the other direction, diagonally, to remove this soot. The soot is an insulator. And as you can see here, it's not really thick on this burner. I have seen it where you literally cannot see the fingers anymore. Soot will lower the efficiency of your burner. It'll cost you in oil. So it's very important that you clean this once a year before the heating season. So I'm going to clean these off, maybe get a better light in here, and let you see the results. Okay, I want to show you here kind of what the difference is. I got a bit of a light here so we can see. So this is the one heat exchanger. You can see that there's pins here and here, and the gases flow up from the firebox and past these, and that's what transfers the heat from the flue gases into the water in your boiler. This is where the money you spend on your oil turns into the heat for your house. Alright, so it's real important that you get this as clean as you possibly can. You can see that these look fairly clean. I ran the brushes down this side and down that side. I also took a hand wire brush and cleaned off all here, also into the flue entrance. And then that's the clean. And this is what it looked like before it was cleaned. And you can see down in here. You can see here there's a bit of a coating. It's not very heavy. That kind of comes off almost with my fingers. It's a little easier to clean when it's warm than when it's cold. It tends to get a little gummy when it's cold. Once you've cleaned this off, you're going to use something like a shop vac to get down in here and suck all the loose particles off. You're also going to have to clean down in the firebox, and I'll show you that in a minute. The kind of shop vac you should use should have a 2-stage filter. The regular paper filter all by itself won't work. It'll tend to allow these foreign particles to come right through and blow into your room. So you want to have something like a microfilter that goes over the top of the paper filter, or something to help the vacuum trap this dust. So I'm going to clean this side, and then I'm going to show you what it's like down below. Okay, so the dust is settled. I took the mask off. So you can see now it's all nice and clean in here. Use the combination of that rod brush, or that's actually a specialized heat exchanger brush, a handheld wire brush, and a little brass brush like this to get down in here and scrub and get everything loose. I have seen technicians use a spray cleaner. That's really only useful if you have a small amount of buildup like I had on here. And what it does is it cleans it off and lets it drip down into the firebox, and then when you light the burner back up, it just burns off. Yeah, I don't like to do that because I don't like soaking that stuff into the bottom of the insulation in the firebox. So now we're done with the top here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put the cover back on, making sure that, like this, all the gasket material gets put back where it belongs and that it's a good seal. When you tighten down the bolts, it's important to remember that you're not bolting something to the side of a rocket ship. They really only need to be tight enough to form a good and thorough seal. So I'll do that, put the top back on, and then I'll show you what we got to do inside the firebox. Okay, here we are back down in the firebox, and you can see there's some debris that has fallen down into the bottom from the cleaning process, and we're going to vacuum that up. Now, one of the things you have to be very careful of when you're vacuuming is that you do not get the hose directly up against the refractory material, which is the insulation that protects this firebox. This is fragile and you'll damage it. So what I always do is I put my fingers over the ends and I vacuum that way. That way I make sure I don't accidentally suck up the insulation. It's rather difficult to replace this, and you have to go to get special material that's actually wet when you get it, and then when you fire it up and you heat it, it hardens and conforms to the inside of the firebox. The other thing you need to remember to clean while you're in here, and I'll get the light up, is up here. That's the bottom of the heat exchanger, and you have to make sure that that is all nice and clean as well. So I'm going to do cleaning up in here. I got a little wire brush. I'll clean up the edge of the door opening, and then we'll finish up here and close the door and work on the burner. Okay, so we've closed everything off here. We've tightened the bolts here and on the bottom. Again, remember, you don't have to ratchet them down. You have to make sure that they're tight enough so that they don't vibrate loose and that the gasket doesn't leak. Speaking of the gasket, while you're closing the door, make sure that it's in its proper groove around the door handle edge. You don't want it to get bound up. And close the door and secure it in place. So the next step in the maintenance is going to be the replacement of the nozzle and the cleaning and adjustments of the electrodes. So the first thing you have to do is you take a screwdriver and you loosen these two screws here on the top of the burner motor, and you move these tabs out of the way. That will allow you to swing this open and reveal the top of the electrode connections. Now, a couple of things. One is the springs here. These touch these metal rods. The transformer for the ignition systems in this piece on the top. There's also right here a optical sensor, which is looking down the burner pipe to make sure that the flame comes on. So this is what trips your cutoff switch in the event of a burner no light. You have to make sure that there's no dirt or grease or anything in here, that it's all nice and clean. So the next step for my particular burner is to loosen the fuel line. I use a 7/16 inch wrench on this nut. This is a compression nut. I already pre-loosened it. That comes off and sits to the side. And then I used a pair of automatic channel locks to loosen this nut here. And you can see I've already loosened it. One of the things you have to make sure is this plate, don't loosen it or move it. It's the adjustment to the depth of the burner nozzle and the end of the burner. So we want to make sure we don't move that. So we take this and unscrew it all the way, and then I just let it slip over the fuel line pipe like that. And now we can take the burner assembly out. There's no need to take the burner apart. You don't need to take these nuts off here. You don't need to separate the adapter. You just need to take those two things off. This will pull to one side, and with a little wiggling will come right out. So there is your electrodes. As soon as I get it to focus, there are your electrodes and your nozzle assembly. There will be a little bit of oil in the nozzle, so make sure that if you tip it up, that you do so over the top of a tray. So now we're going to take this into the workshop, and we're going to clean it up, replace the nozzle, and adjust the electrodes. Okay, well, here we are on the bench. This is the burner assembly. You can see the three main components, the two electrodes and the nozzle and the fuel line. So what we need to do first off, before I even start, is I kind of clean things up. I have my little brass brush. Use brass because you don't want to really scratch anything, and you clean off particularly the tips of the electrodes. There can be some buildup of carbon and soot and what have you on the end of that. So you just clean them off, and I'm just kind of showing for demonstration. I'll do a little more thorough job. And then you get some sort of cleaner spray. I use like a gun cleaner. It's nice because it doesn't, it cleans grease and oil, but it doesn't attack plastic. I also am going to give a quick squirt of this into the bottom of the cup for the filter, just to make sure that we get any debris that might have collected in there clean. So I just give this, I'll let that soak for a little bit. And then we're just, you don't have to go too nuts depending on how dirty it is. I just clean the whole thing off. And then I use a rag and I wipe things off, and I make sure that there's no buildup of carbon or soot or anything like that. Remember, carbon is conductive, so it can deteriorate the performance of your spark during the ignition cycle. So let me show you how this works. You can see here where the electrodes are in relation to the burner. They're just ahead of and just to the side of the nozzle, in a spot where the oil will atomize as it's spraying out of the end. During the beginning of the startup cycle, there is a spark that will jump across those 2 points and ignite the fuel and get it started. Once it's run for 30 seconds or so, that spark will stop. On most systems, some systems it runs continuously, but on this one it will stop, and the burner will just keep itself going. If you're having ignition problems, usually the first place to look would be the filter, followed by the pump, followed by this nozzle and its internal filter, and the placement of the electrodes and any carbon buildup or what have you. If you look on the side of the nozzle, you'll see that there are markings. This one says that it's an 80H. That's what kind of nozzle that is. It's it's how much fuel flows through it and the pattern of the spray. All right, it's very important when you replace this that you replace it with the exact same one. Now, the way I remember is that you see this little bottle here. This is what it comes in, because you're not supposed to touch the filter that's at the bottom. You see the little brass at the bottom, that's a filter. You're not supposed to touch that with your fingers, because the oils from your fingers and any skin sloughing off will clog that filter. All right, but it says, see, 80H on the cap. So I just take this little cap and I slip it over one of the bolts on the boiler just to kind of keep it there. And that's how I remember what nozzle goes into this machine. So when I have to go out and get a new one, I just look at this cap from the old one and say, okay, it's an 80H, and I go out and I get the right one. So now I'm going to just finish cleaning this up, and I'm going to get a wrench on here and on here, and I'm going to loosen and unscrew this nozzle. Okay, so we put the new nozzle back on and tightened it down. Remember, snug, not over tightened. And then this is that Z tool that I was talking about at the beginning of the video. This is the only tool that I've purchased specifically for the maintenance of this burner. It's made by Beckett, and its job is to set the electrodes. The way it works is that when it's inserted over the top, the electrodes fit in that little notch right at the end there. That's where they're supposed to be by specification. Now, you could set this up with a little ruler, and the Beckett manual do give the specification of how far above the nozzle it's supposed to be, how far apart they're supposed to be, how far away from the center of the nozzle. But this is by far the easiest way to do that. You want to try and avoid bending these electrodes if you can. These are porcelain insulators. They can crack. And you really don't want to be wrenching on these if you don't have to. The way you adjust it is you loosen this screw, and that allows you to rotate and raise and lower to get them in the right place. And then if you have to, you can increase or slightly increase or slightly decrease this bend here in the electrode to get it in precisely the right spot. The other thing you also should be looking for is, as you see here, the electrodes are pointy. If they've become rounded over, then what you can do is either buy new electrodes or you can restore them to a point. The point is important because that improves and directs the arc in the right place so that it lights the burner. All right, so this tool fits over the nozzle. You loosen this screw just a little bit, enough so that you can move these things by hand, and you kind of wiggle them gently into place so that they're precisely in that right location, so that the tips are flush with the top of the tool and they sit right in the little notch on either side. When you're all done, don't forget to pull the tool off the end, and also don't forget to snug this nut back down. You want to make sure it's snug but not over tight, because you can crush these porcelain insulators. After that, if there's any more cleaning that needs to be done, you can do that, and then we can go ahead and start putting this back in the burner. What I did with the old nozzle is I put it back into the container, but I put an X on the side of it so that it knows that it's an old nozzle. One of the reasons why you replace it is because this hole that's in the end, that little tiny hole that the oil sprays out of, can wear and enlarge. Also, there's small little grooves on an insert on the inside that get the oil into a spinning motion in that cone shape to make it more efficient. And as this wears out, obviously it uses more and more oil. The flame isn't the proper dimensions or thickness, and it cuts down on the efficiency. So I replace these once a year. They're about $10 to $15 a piece. Again, remember, you want to make sure that you get the proper one for your burner. If you're in doubt, you're going to have to pull the burner off and take a look at the markings on the side. If for some reason you still don't know what it is, bring the whole burner, whole assembly here to your local oil heat parts place, and I'm sure they can figure it out for you. They'll also need to know the make and model of the burner and the boiler that is attached to it. Okay, so we've inserted the burner assembly back inside. It should not take any force to put it back in. It should just slide right back in. The hose aligned with the side goes through the hole. You snug down this retaining ring, then you snug down this compression fitting. Don't over tighten anything. Snug is good enough. You know, just past tight is all you really need. Make sure there's nothing you didn't drop anything down in here and block the fan assembly. Check the sides of the burner. Make sure all the vent holes are clear. They don't have any debris in them or any kind of dust or dirt that's gotten in there. Alright. Push the door back down. The transformer back down. Flip the little tabs over. And then with a screwdriver we're going to tighten down those two screws. And then we'll go to put the oil assembly back together again. Okay, so now we're going to proceed to put the oil line and the oil filter back together. I have already reattached the oil line and tightened it. Again, not over tightened, just snug so it doesn't leak. This is, everything up to the pump is suction. So making sure that you have a nice airtight seal so that you don't draw any air into the system will mean that you won't have any burner failures, especially in the dead of winter when it's 20 degrees outside and you don't know why the burner isn't working. Now, when you're putting it back together, you're provided with 3 gaskets. The first one is the big rubber gasket that goes around the top of the oil filter cup. The second gasket is that little gasket there that goes on that bolt that puts things back together. The third gasket is a little gasket that goes under this nut. Now this is a vent that you could take off so that you could bleed air or vacuum air out of the system and kind of prime the filter. And if you take this off, you're going to have to replace that gasket. I just used the pump and in combination with the drain petcock here to drain the air out of the system and get the oil flowing. You'll also purge air with the tiger loop. So the way this goes back together is you put the filter back in exactly the same way that you took the old one out. So in my case, the screen goes up, it goes down over the post in the center, and it slides into place. One of the things too I'll mention while I'm here that you can check is you see there's a nut on the bottom. There is a gasket underneath that. That's to remove that center post if you have to. You should not have to loosen this or take it off, but it's always a good idea to check it just to make sure that it's tight. Once you've got the filter back in, you take the rubber O-ring and you lay it in the groove, making sure that it isn't going to get pinched when you put it back together. Then you're going to insert the filter up from the bottom and put the bolt in the hole in the top. Now I'm going to need to have 2 hands to do this, so I'll get that started and then I'll restart the video. Okay, so we put the filter back in, it's all slugged back down, nice and ready to go. Fuel line is attached. So now what we're going to do is we're going to put the connector back together. Little tricky here, doing it with one hand. It goes underneath. And it, sorry for the shaky camera work, it goes in, it twists and locks in place. This is something that I custom made when I put this burner on so that I would be able to very easily take it apart. The other thing too is this alarm wire, which I'll connect back together in a minute because I need 2 hands to do that. And then we have one last task to do, or actually 2 last tasks to do. One is to check the flue to make sure that it's nice and clean. And the last is going to be to turn things on and check the pressure of the pump to make sure that it's within specifications. And then we should be done with this service. I'll get back to you in a moment as soon as I'm done here. It's kind of hard to do things one-handed, and I don't have a camera that I can put on a tripod, so I'm kind of doing this with a cell phone. And we'll go over the rest of the operation in just a minute. Okay, so I did a little cleaning in here. You can see, unfortunately, I couldn't do the work with one hand while I filmed it. So what I did was I kind of scraped down the inside here, and then I got in there with the shop vac and vacuumed up the soot and debris that was laying on the bottom. There was very little, and usually this once a year, if you clean this, there is very little. The important thing to remember here is that at the end of the flue, there's a cavity at the bottom, which is supposed to catch any debris or soot, and you have to make sure you get down into that. It can get a little compacted over time, so I have a little rod that has kind of a hook on the end, and I kind of scrape it loose so that I can vacuum it up. The other thing I also did many years ago is I put a cap on the top of the chimney that prevents rain and animals and debris from coming down the chimney. That tends to keep the inside of the chimney dry so that the soot doesn't adhere very well, and it makes it easier to clean. When I first got the house and there was no cap up there and I went to clean it, the soot was like concrete, and I couldn't get it off. And I had to actually go in there with a metal rod and a hammer almost and chisel it away to get it cleaned up. But this is very important because, again, if this flue gets blocked, you're going to get carbon monoxide back into the house, and you're going to have a problem. And so you got to make sure that that's done. Also, with an oil burner, you tend to get soot blowing back, which can get all over everything. So getting this clean once a year is a very good thing. Inspecting to make sure that the pipe hasn't rotted out. Flue gases can be corrosive, so you make sure that everything looks good. And then we'll put it back together, and we'll start doing the final testing and getting the burner ready. Okay, so we've put the flue all back together. We've turned on the fuel valve. You tighten the handle as opposed to loosen it. It's kind of counterintuitive, but that's the way it works. All right, I have already bled the air out of the system. It's going to vary from burner to burner. On mine, when it first starts, you hold the reset button for 15 seconds until the prime light lights up. Then you let go, and then as soon as the motor starts, you, within 10 seconds, push the button again. That will override the no flame sensor and allow the pump to run continuously, and it just keeps going until the air is bled out of the system. All right, most burners have some sort of instruction placard on it or near it that will tell you how everything works. I got this card when I bought the pump, so I just attach it here for convenience sake. The last thing we're going to test is we're going to test the pump pressure. Now, I've made this little tool. It's basically a pressure gauge with a couple of adapters. It fits into the bleed screw hole. And all you have to do is run the pump, check the reading, make sure that it's in with specifications. Again, that's going to really depend on the burner and pump assembly that you have. Check with the manufacturer to find out what it's supposed to be. So the last thing we're going to do is we're going to turn on the power. The AquaSmart comes online. The burner goes into pre-time. It runs for about 5 seconds. You can see that we're getting pressure here. Tighten this up a little more. And that looks normal or operational. And we'll shut it off. Looks like my tool needs to be have a little stuff put on the threads to keep it from leaking. So now I'm going to take this out. I'm going to put the bleed screw back in and tighten it up. Going to clean up my hands and clean up the oil. Put everything back the way it's supposed to be. Do quick vacuuming around here. Make sure there's no oil spills. And turn the furnace back on. We should be good to go. Thank you everyone for watching with me. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Any comments that are constructive, I would welcome them. Again, I am not in the business of burner repair. This is my own personal furnace. I have learned this over time. Again, if you are not exactly sure and or trained on how to do this, be sure you hire someone that is. I hope you all have a happy, safe, and warm winter. Thank you a lot for watching.